I was born in Palestine, which is now Eretz Israel, in a quite known old village called Rishon LeZion, where the famous wineries of Carmel Mizrahi exist. And I spent most of my young age until the war of 1948 in this place, going to school there and joining the underground Haganah forces at the age of 14, because the Haganah had youth groups for the first 2 years, but at the age of 16 you became a real soldier. You start to train clandestinely with weapons, etc. I became then what you might call like a sergeant, a section commander in a special course. But then in 1946, when I finished high school, I joined a force which was really a legal force in terms of the British mandate. It was called the Jewish Settlement Police. It was a police, came under the British police, but it was meant to defend the settlements against Arab attacks in the style of 1936, 1939. And I was the commander of the local small group of about 10 or 12 people. Then the war started, I was in that. And since I was already a young commander for the Haganah too, so I was sent immediately to an officer's course in February of 1948 for 2 months. It had to be very short and brief. And then I became a platoon commander in the famous Brigade Givat, the famous Givati Brigade, where I later on became a company commander, commanding about 100 people, and I spent the war at that brigade until the end of the war. The village, now it's a big town where I was born and grew up, Rishon LeZion, claims to be the first Zionist settlement in Palestine. It was established in 1882. There's a controversy between Petah Tikva and Rishon, who was the first, but it doesn't matter now. And it was a small town, you might call it, of mostly citrus orchards growers. So the feel of patriotic Zionist belief and advocacy was strong in our entire childhood. Except that when I became 10, I joined a youth movement, which also was avidly Zionist, but was also Marxist. Hashomer HaTzair, which was a kibbutz movement, which advocated a binational state. Because they believed that there's another nation who lives here, and we have to find a way to live together in the same state. And of course, as a young follower of this movement, I believed that too. It disappeared in the smoke of the war within a few days, I would say. In November 29th, the UN decided on the creation of a Palestinian partition with 2 states, Palestinian and Israeli. And we were dancing at night in the streets. And being the commander of the local police group, I was ordered to escort with a rifle and a friend also with a rifle the first bus that went to Tel Aviv, and we were attacked on the way. Nothing happened. It was just shooting here and there in one of the Arab villages on the road. And from that point on, it was clear that this is a different game. It's not a game of friendship and international love. It's a zero-sum game, where if we lose, we'll not only not have a state, but perhaps we couldn't preserve our lives here. So at that point, it was Zionism net, without any hesitation or second thoughts of how can we actually produce it. But on the whole, when you lived in this village, you saw the development of early Zionism in a very clear way, because there were layers of the society, the veteran people who owned the orchards, who were rather affluent. They used to go to Europe to have hot baths in Carlsbad or in Marienbad. They used to send their children to Beirut to study in the American university. And the second layer was the simple people, the workers, and especially newcomers, as they kept coming in. These were mostly socialists, members of youth movements, of the different youth movements, struggling with each other according to the fights on the different opinions. I remember that was also a revisionist Beitar group, which was the extreme right to my movement, which was of the extreme left. So we used to fight, not too hard a word, but would certainly debate hotly about the way to make the Zionist idea being fulfilled, to fulfill the Zionist idea. There were also another layer of newcomers of the old generation, older people, who were more religious, but on the whole it was a very secular society. There were synagogues. We used to go to the synagogues on holidays as part of our Jewish upbringing and a part of our Jewish identification, because there was no question of that, but not because of religiosity in no way. On the whole, I and my friends who studied in high school there, went to Hagana, went to youth movements, we grew up as secular people. Different group was the Yemenites, who came at the turn of the 20th century and formed a special community in the village. They were somewhat poorer, but the second generation already went with us in school and joined the Hagana, and they became normalized like us. But the older generation were keeping the old ways of life. So you couldn't differentiate between the different layers of the immigration, the layers of the new social existence. And then there were the Arabs. There were a number of Arab villages quite around, within a walk of an hour or 3/4 of an hour. We used to visit them, we used to meet them out in the fields, in the orchards. And many of them came into town to sell vegetables, to work. Women used to work at the homes of those who can afford it for the washing day. And so we spoke pidgin Arabic, but still we spoke some Arabic. So it was a clear presence in our life. It stopped between 1936, when I was 8 years old, and 1939 because of the Arab revolt. They disappeared. But then they came back. During World War II, there were some of them who actually lived in the village, in the town, because they worked with the larger cow sheds or larger agricultural farms that were in the village. And of course, when the war started, they all disappeared. And later on, we pushed them out from their villages too. So slowly, the area around the village became part of a up-and-coming Jewish state. There was in the village and in the whole country, in the Jewish community, a clear cleavage, a clear distinction between what we used to call general Zionists, mostly the bourgeois families, the Titus orchard growers, the merchants, the storekeepers, etc., and the socialist Zionists, which mostly were anchored in kibbutzim and in the youth movement that educated to kibbutzim, which believed that Zionism should be accomplished through building up of a society of justice, of equality, of a socialist society. I belong to that second one, but I belong to a smaller group that was critical of Ben-Gurion and his main socialist group that was really the dominant part of the community, of the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. Next to the village, within a walking distance, there was the largest British military camp in the town called Sarafend. Now it's called Tzrifin. It was Hebraized. It was founded by General Alabi when he conquered Palestine in 1917-18 and became the largest depot of all kinds of military units. So the British soldiers used to come daily to the cafe shops, to the coffee houses in the village. We used to meet them a lot. And as children, we liked them because they used to give us some candies and pictures from players, cigarettes, etc. So we would run after them to get all these goodies. But when we grew up, we became part of the struggle against the British regime that was already after World War II, when it became clear that the British are not going to complete their promises of the Balfour Declaration, which means that they will limit more and more Jewish immigration to the country and the ability of Jews to buy land in the country. And during that period, there were actual fights, not only by the Irgun, by the Etzel, which were very actively fighting against the British, but also the Haganah, to which I belonged, and was by far the largest organization, defense organization of the country. There were perpetrated attacks against British targets in 1945, 46. I was too young to be part of that, but we used to spy, you might call it, on the Arab villages around to prepare ourselves for the day in which we knew will come, when the British leave, that the fight will not be against the British, but between the Jews and the Arabs. So we used to build up files of pictures and details about the villages so they can be attacked when the point will come. And as at the age of 18, even less 17, I was already part of such an operation. When the British would put curfew in the village, we used to try our best to harass the soldiers, to call them names, etc. That was our part of our venom against them. What I remember more is the connection since I was in the Chanutzik youth movement, the pioneer youth movement, going to help new settlements to establish themselves within a day. So when the next day comes, it will be already established. So already at the age of 14, 15, I used to do that, to join some of those new settling days, so to speak. There was the British police, but the police in the community itself was, we were part of the police, and there was also a regular policeman to keep peace and law and order in the village, but that was irrelevant. There were two main police, there were two larger police stations, or citadels you might call it, one to the north of the village, one to the south, within 2 miles. And they were called the Tegard, they were called the Tegard police station, which was by the name of the man the engineer who devised them. And for us, these were the location of the hated British regime. It was symbolically like a fortress we should one day conquer and push them out. At the end, we didn't need it because the British decided to leave Palestine because they wanted to leave Palestine. Not because of Etzel, not because of the Haganah, none of these really pushed them out, but the budget. After World War II, they needed to cut down the budgets. They left India, they left many other places, and they left Palestine. So we didn't have to actually fight them out. I do not remember, certainly not in my youth movement, but also in my high school, of anybody talking or imagining that the day will come when I will just leave the place, that they'll disappear. As a historian, I know that there was always some talk about transfer, although the Jews normally didn't talk about it. They were afraid that talking about transfer will delegitimize the yearning or the desire to have a Jewish state. Because if the Jewish state is dependent on throwing out the Arabs, the world will not allow it. So the Zionists were afraid to raise this issue. It was raised by non-Jews. For example, the Labour Party in the early 40s thought of the transfer as a possible solution. There was a talk of exchange of population. But on the whole, I don't remember anybody in the Haganah or in what I read in papers, and by then I could read papers daily, any talk about pushing out the Arabs. So we thought that we will end up, especially after the resolution of the UN of the partition, that we'll end up have a part of the land a Jewish state, which will create by rapid immigration a majority of Jews, which the Arabs will then have to live within a state which is primarily Jewish, and next door there'll be a state which will be primarily Palestinian, Arab. The Haganah was clandestine, was, you might call it secret, but was not that secret, because it was so much part of the community. In Rishon LeZion there were half a dozen ethnics, and no one from the Lehi, as far as I know. But every young man in Rishon LeZion was member of the Haganah, and the British knew it. Now, having also had a uniform that was given me by His Majesty, I sadly was recognized also as a member of the Haganah. I remember our formal commander was a British officer who came from Yorkshire. And he used to come to the station and see that the rack of the rifles was empty. And he used to say laughingly, "Tell the fucking Haganah to leave some of the weapons here." And would laugh. So it was not a real secret. The British knew exactly, maybe not who is commanding what or the details. Even that they must have known. And in the community itself, in the life of the community, was not much. But the Haganah tried to behave and create a myth of being a subversive force, being a secret clandestine force. So when you were called to join the Haganah, they normally used to perform you might call it a show, a ceremony. I remember having been walked to a remote orchard, an old packing house in the which was all dark, no light at all, and I was asked to enter into a room, and in the room there were 3 adult people whose face I couldn't see because the light was on me, and there was a Bible on the table and a revolver to symbolize what I'm going to do it, and I was asked to be sworn in. I swore allegiance to the Zionist cause and to the authorities, which were our authorities, that is the Jewish Agency and the leadership that gives us orders, gives the Haganah orders. So, of course, it was not really necessary, but it was for us a great day. I was 14 years old. So as a young man, I was very impressed by it. And it still highlighted the fact that you have to behave discreetly. If you know anything about a cache of weapons, that is a real secret. You should give it out. And sometimes I did escort the people that dealt with the weapons to a hiding place, to escort them, to defend them. So I knew some of them where they were. So some of these things you're supposed not to uncover. But I was never interrogated on such issue. On the national level, being a member of the Haganah, Haganah altogether was totally commanded and loyal to what we then called the organized Yishuv, the organized Jewish community, under the Jewish Agency and other institutions up there at the top. There was also a body that was in charge of education, Jewish Hebrew education. Ben-Gurion was at the top, and we already knew some of the leaders who took part in building up those pre-state institutions, which eventually became the Jewish government, the Jewish Knesset, etc. On the local level, the main body was the municipality. It was not really a municipium, it was still a village, or a large village you might call it. There were about 4,000 people living in Rishon LeZion when I was young. But there was an elected committee in election, in real democratic elections. And there was the head of this body, which was like the mayor in Rishon LeZion. They were running all affairs in the village, in the town. Of course, the post was British, the police was British, of course, but transportation, for example, there were Jewish bus companies. There were committees that dealt with water and electricity in the community, fundraising or other tax collecting, and especially in education. From the way back, my school was founded very early on, was the first Hebrew-speaking school in Palestine in 1885. Was completely dependent on the Jewish authorities, not on the British authorities. We never saw, or we saw an English teacher who was a Jewish who came to teach us English, but we saw no British officer or official at any time. It was completely independent structure where we had Hebrew and Jewish Zionist education with Zionist flags at festivities and singing Hatikvah, and of course learning all about Jewish history and Zionist history and Hebrew new literature, etc. So on the whole, when I became aware of politics like that, to me, Rishon LeZion was all the Jewish state. Was an independent area where you could see even the policeman, the local policeman was Jewish. But occasionally you could see a traffic police or could see the British soldiers coming in and out. But on the whole, you felt like living within a framing of Jewish sovereignty, or at least local sovereignty. The first attack, which ended with bloodshed, occurred in November 30th, a few hours after the decision of the UN was taken, near Petah Tikva. Was attacked by an Arab group, and 5 Israeli Jews, not Israeli then, 5 Jews who traveled from Petah Tikva to Jerusalem were killed. There were sporadic attacks and sporadic shooting here and there. So in my case, the bus I took as an escort to go to Tel Aviv got a few bullets which didn't damage anybody from the side of the road. But this then happened more often. And very soon, the whole traffic was diverted in a way that it will not have to pass through the 2 Arab villages that originally were alongside the road to Tel Aviv, from my town to Tel Aviv. And now we use a side road which was semi-paved, not really paved, but arranged so buses can travel on it, on the sand dunes, not closer to the sea coast. And we use that road, and even that was defended later on by strongholds of the Haganah along the road. I personally was not anymore in the town because I was sent to an officer's course. But in January, a whole group of my own friends, including those I commanded in Haganah, people my age, were training now as a semi-military unit further south near Gedera, near what the town of Ashdod is now. Were attacked, and 11 of them were killed, my close friends, all of them. I knew them personally. Many of them, I visited their home, they visited my home. We exchanged stamps as collectors. We used to go to swim in the local small swimming pools in the orchards. So we actually were close friends. 11 of them died in January. I wasn't there at the moment, but I happened to come for vacation, and I saw their bodies laid out in the municipal hall before they were taken to the cemetery to be buried. Again, this is one example of the kind of experiences one had that brought it to your mind that it is no more a game of friendship, it's a zero-sum game. It's either we or they. When this subverted road was created, this became part of a network that came from Tel Aviv to Holon through the dunes to Rishon LeZion and then down south and into the area of Hulda and later on to Bab el-Wad, Sha'ar HaGai today, and to Jerusalem and also to the south, to the Negev, because there were many Jewish settlements. And this route, route that's split into two main routes, they had to be defended by a group of Palmach members who were much more trained and were more agile at hiding their weapons in the buses. Later on, buses were fortified with armor, with metal sheets, and there were also special armor cars with weapons on them. There was occasionally a problem with the British because the British were ready to escort us, but didn't want us to escort ourselves and cause trouble with the Arabs on the road. So there was a controversy of how to safeguard those convoys, and the Haganah wanted to be the master of that issue and not the British, which caused some trouble. During the peak of that period, I was still in the course, because when I finished my officer's course, I became we didn't then call ourselves officers, but platoon commanders, mem, mefaked machlaka in Hebrew, which means a platoon commander. Only later on we started to have ranks and pips on our soldiers. But I was already an officer. And at that time, Haganah was already halfway into a large offensive, which took place from the beginning of April 48, which ended up by really the routing of the local Arab Palestinian forces and also of the force of volunteers that came to help them from other Arab countries, but not of the regular armies of the Arab states. That only came after May 15, when the British left. But I'm talking now in April. And in April, I was already part of this offensive and participated in a number of operations in which we attacked villages. And I was lucky because it so happened that in most of the places where I participated, when we came to the village after some mortar fire or just opening fire from rifles, the Arab escaped of fear, because after Deir Yassin they all were also afraid of this precedent. But when in those places which I heard of, the Arabs did not run away, they of course were chased out. So there were a mix of both, as Benny Morris describes aptly in his book. At that time, we were in a full offensive, which slowly created the basis for the territorial basis for the Jewish state, which was not like later on when we started the big offensive in the south, but already you could speak of say, the whole area from what is today Ashdod, all the way to Haifa, or almost to Hadera, as a Jewish state. It was under Jewish control. The Arabs were not anymore there. Jaffa was occupied. Only very few Arabs remained in Jaffa. What came later on was other targets like Lod and Ramle. That was in July. But I'm talking now about the big offensive, which created the beginning of the territorial base. Let me begin to talk about this subject as a historian, and then I'll come back to my own personal experience. Among the Jews in Palestine and among the Jews of Israel, for many years and until today, there is a strong belief that we were a small force that defeated by valor and wisdom and courage the big Arab forces. And I made a research on this issue, together with many others, of course. It turned out now that there was one period in the war in which the Arabs had a superiority of power, and that was in May, when the Arab armies invaded Palestine and had weapons for which we didn't have an answer, like fighter pilots, which only at one point we could assemble 2 or 3 fighter pilots, but they had a clear superiority and could bomb Tel Aviv without any, and my own town, Rishon LeZion, was bombed too. They had tanks, they had armor cars, effective modern one, they had artillery, and we only, at the end of May, beginning of June, and especially later on, started to have those weapons. So that was a period in which, also, one must say those, they also had the initiative. Having the initiative, they could concentrate their forces on specific targets that they chose. So, for example, a kibbutz like Yad Mordechai, which was conquered by the Egyptian army, was attacked by, say, a battalion, 500, 600 Egyptian fighters, against, at the most, 100 Israeli Jews who were defending. So there are points in which this memory is very strong, but the general notion about this issue among Israelis, especially veterans of my ages, the whole war was like that. And of course, in a very shallow look, we talk about 650,000 Israeli Jews who fought against 1.3 million Palestinians and 40 million Arabs who live in the states adjacent to Palestine. I'm not talking about Morocco or Yemen, but Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt. So with a shallow look, you say, yes, we were a small nation that fought against great multitudes. But research shows that in most of the parts of the war, especially in the first part in which we fought not against the regular armies of the Arab states, but against the Palestinians and some volunteers, that Haganah was organized enough to create within the first few months an overwhelmingly larger force. And the moment the weapons started to come from Czechoslovakia, also a force which had good modern weapons, not tanks, but machine guns and light machine guns, and of course rifles, modern rifles. By April, we had 9 brigades fully equipped, or by middle of April, fully equipped by these weapons. And against us, there were an assortment of semi-organized forces of the Palestinians, of the force of volunteers who came to help them. And it's clear that when we had started the offensive, that we had the upper hand in terms of comparative force. It took the shape, in my own experience, by the fact that those villages which I participated in attacking. In most cases, we were attacked with a whole company force. Company, that means at least 10 light machine guns, 2 or 3 3-inch mortars, fully equipped by submachines and rifles. And the villages were defended in most cases, even if there were local volunteers from outside, by forces, maybe 30 people, 40 people, who were not trained, who were not organized, who were not defended by any trenches or things like that. And the conquest, in all the places that I participated, was an easy game. As I said, when they came into the village was empty because they felt that they had to run away because they were overpowered by us. So it was, at that time, my feeling was it wasn't a great difficulty to do it. There was some occasion which were somewhat more difficult. The fight over the castle, for example, where the local Palestinian forces have gathered hundreds of fighters to try to take it back from our hands. There was heavy fighting with maybe a local superiority to the Arabs. And there are some other examples, but the land-wide picture was that they were not a challenge to us at all. They were not organized. They didn't have good weapons. Soldiers used to desert very early in the fight. There were no superstructure like battalions or brigades as we had. Now all that came about because the Haganah was already organized, at least on a company level, way back from the 30s, 40s. But as of December 47, especially in this winter, very quickly those local companies, like the local company of my village, became part of a battalion, and the battalion became part of a brigade. So as I said, by beginning of April, we had already 9 well-organized brigades. If you ask me in February or in March, what will be the outcome of the war, I will tell you that I think it will be a Jewish state in which there will be hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in the villages where they were still. As a historian, I also know that until the spring, until April, not that the Israelis did not want them to run away if they could, but nobody imagined that it will actually happen. There was a beginning of Arabs and also Jews leaving the border areas in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, but except for 1 or 2 villages that were deserted, Arab villages were deserted, and 1 or 2 Jewish villages that were deserted at that time, all of them stayed put. They were still in their places until April. And I think that even the leadership did not imagine that what happened will happen. There was no reason to expect that. And certainly nobody thought that we can actually chase all of them out. But the moment they started, out of fear of the war and as a result of Deir Yassin, to run away, the possibility that we will have a land empty of the Arabs became a clear thought. A clear thought in the mind of smaller echelon people like myself, and certainly in the upper echelons. It was not quite clear at the very beginning, but it became slowly more clear. For me personally, it took the shape of an inner decision of myself. You wanted a war, okay, now you run away, you'll never come back. So the notion of having this land empty of Arabs was already part of my life. It especially took shape more later on in the summer and early fall, where it was clear that there are tens of thousands of refugees out there in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the hilly areas of Palestine. And there was some talk that they might just get up and come back again. And we were ordered to shoot at them. We will try. And I remember I had no compunction. I would have shot at them. Because the notion was, you decided to have this war. You wanted us being thrown to the sea. You've been thrown off the homes. Now we can have a land which is ready for new immigrants to settle. So the emptiness of the land was already a clear experience in my own life. The Haganah offensive was planned by what is now very well known everywhere and by the Arabs especially as Plan D. Plan D was a plan that was designed to be performed, to be put to action when the British will be gone, and then the Israeli forces, the Haganah forces, not yet the army because it was not yet a state, should take over all the territories that were allotted by the UN resolution to the Jewish part, plus try to defend those Jewish settlements who were destined to remain in the Arab state, and take over important key strategic position which may defend against incoming armies if the Arabs decide to invade. That's in principle. One part of that plan also saw the possibility that there'll be a difficulty in building a new front line, where in the front line you've got large Arab villages which have even some weapons and some organized local forces, and therefore the thought of evacuating Arab villages that are on the front or on the route in which the Arab armies can now come and be assisted by them was already part of the plan. The plan did not include an overall plan to unsettle the Arabs inside Israel, inside what will remain Israel. But events preempted putting the plan into action. It happened when in the end of March, there were 3 large convoys, Jewish convoys. One of them was destined to go up to Jerusalem, one to a kibbutz called Yechiam, and one to a group of kibbutzim called Gush Etzion. All the 3 of them were blocked by Arab forces, who on the location had superior forces because they could concentrate a few hundred fighters against a convoy which was defended by a few dozen Israeli escort people. And all the 3 cases were a glaring Israeli defeat, with a lot of casualties in all the 3 of these cases. But the main worry was that Jerusalem was now in siege, because if you cannot run a convoy to bring food, and certainly not weapons, but even food or fuel to Jerusalem, it will be starved to death. So the Haganah, without prior preparation, not part of Plan D, as a separate plan, decided to try now a special operation which will take somehow over the control over the road, as I described before, from Hulda to Jerusalem. The operation was called Nachshon, and an entire brigade was formed specially for that operation. Weapons which did not yet come at that point, or the beginning, they began to come from Czechoslovakia, but other weapons were collected from around the country, and platoons and companies were assembled to perform this operation. What happened in this operation was not only there was a success because we managed to bring through major convoys of supplies to Jerusalem, which really kept Jerusalem alive for the rest of the war. Because later on we didn't manage to do it anymore, but that was the great pulse of supplies to Jerusalem. But also it turned out that the British allowed the Israeli forces to occupy villages and stay in them. that was a novelty, because until the British was still around, and they did not allow any one of the sides, either Jewish or Arab, they couldn't stop attacks because they always came late to the attack. But they would ask the sides to go away and to discontinue the attack, and did not allow the holding of this position by the enemy's side. And all of a sudden, in one or two places, especially in Castel, the British did not intervene. They did not intervene because they were halfway out and only defended some arteries in which they were supposed to complete their withdrawal. But that route that went from Shar Hagai to Jerusalem via Castel was not in their plans, and they didn't mind what happened there. That meant that we can now try to create ourselves this territorial base which Plan D envisaged, to create a completely Jewishly controlled territory. At the same time, the very same time, there was a great attack of the so-called Arab Liberation Army, which was an army made up of volunteers from Syria, from Iraq, from Lebanon, etc., commanded by Fawzi Kaoukji, was a hero of the 1936 revolt. And they tried to attack a kibbutz near Haifa, Mishmar HaEmek, and failed. And during that operation, all the Arab villages around Mishmar HaEmek were occupied by the Haganah, and the British did not demand us of leaving. So around Mishmar HaEmek, all of a sudden, they create a whole belt of Arab-free area. Then Operation D was put into operation almost without any special order. It started to roll out. And each brigade of the 9 brigades that were now the organized force of the Haganah had its own territory, its own area, in which it had clear details of what it ought to do, where it had to conquer, where it had to ask the Arabs to leave, etc., etc. And that was the point in which I came back from the army, from the officers' course, and I joined the forces of my brigade in this operation at the beginning, very beginning, in the area of Jaffa and Tel Aviv, because Jaffa was still in Arab hands. And around Jaffa, there were at least half a dozen Arab villages, large Arab villages, which were still defended by Arab forces. And the first operation in which I took part was called the Operation Hametz, because it was Pesach, and Hametz means unleavened bread. So I took the symbol of that holiday, in which the Haganah did not attack Jaffa. It was the Etzel that attacked Jaffa directly. It was against the decision of the Haganah, but they did it. But the Haganah occupied all these 6, 7 villages around, and I participated in conquest of one of them. That village in which I was shot first, the day after the war started. So that was, and then it was rolling on and on in different areas, parts later on in the south, in which we cleared up a large piece of territory, which then became strictly Jewish territory. The offensive of Operation D went on while the Arab regular armies invaded. So it really went on until the end of May, where some of the forces were confronting the invading Arab armies, but part of my brigade continued, and my battalion continued to clear up some of the remaining villages in the area under our control. So it was kind of overlapping the period which I described before as a difficult period in which we had to hold against regular armies very well equipped with modern weapons. At the end of May, my platoon, my whole battalion, was deployed around the spearhead of the Egyptian army that invaded along the seacoast and reached the point near what is today Ashdod. At that time was a village, Arab village called Isdud. There was a deep river there with a bridge, and the bridge was blown up, And symbolically, we love to think that this is the bridge that stopped the Egyptians from approaching Tel Aviv, which is nonsense. They could have easily bypassed it. But symbolically, it's called the Ahlam bridge, the bridge up to here and no more. So it's symbolic the place where. But our battalion was deployed right around this area, and this time on well-entrenched strongholds. I took a hill where some of the citizens of the area dug us the trenches before we came there, and was already with bunkers and well entrenched in a hill, just overlooking the new Egyptian forces that were now deploying in this point where they stopped. That really was the beginning of my so-called regular military experience, not against militias, but against armies. Certainly, I personally can testify for it, but I think all the Israeli members of Haganah, who now very soon will become members of IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, because the state was declared on May 15, and Haganah was turned into being the Israeli army on May 27th. So at that point, I can say that there was a strong sense of fear, not so much personal fear, but worry that we might not hold against those superior armies. We knew that we don't have airplanes, we don't have tanks, we don't have artillery, and they have. I remember, as if it's today, on, I think it was May the 20th or 23, I was then stationed in an old military camp near an air base, a military air base, in the south, about, I would say, 15 miles from Latrun. And later on, I found out that in Latrun there was raging a very major battle between the Jordanian army and the Israeli army over the road to Jerusalem again. But I remember having heard bombing and shelling, artillery shells. And I remember asking myself, will I hold my nerves under such a condition? I was sure I will. But I remember that I asked myself the question. We were never under artillery shells at this point. There were some artillery shells fell in Jerusalem in the end of April, but not in my front. Only then we could hear them, and very soon from the Egyptian side, there was shelling and bombing from the air. So we were not sure that, although we were organized in battalions and brigades, and we knew that we are not forceless, but especially in terms of the new weapons that came into the battlefield, they were a great worry. And after a few battles against the Egyptians at that time, I remember, for example, in another stronghold that I was stationed against the Egyptian forces in this area, we were shelled. And to my surprise, I found out that not every shell hits you. Spread all over. Some of the shells fell among my soldiers, some were wounded, but after heavy shelling, we still were alive. So that was an important awakening. But the main reason for gaining again self-confidence was that we actually worked only at night. When we attacked the Egyptians, we attacked them at night. And at night, artillery doesn't help them. And tanks are not any good. So we felt that even we might have only small submachine guns and some light machine guns, that we can prevail in such clashes when it happens at night. We should be careful not to remain there during the day, because during the day they will have, they'll put into action their superior forces. But most of what we have done was fighting at night. By the end of May, we ordered a uniform. Very soon after, we had ranks on our shoulders. We became a regular army. But the the expansion, the rapid expansion of the Israeli forces made it quite happen often that young officers jumped off in ranks quickly. At one point, I was still a platoon commander. We were stationed in another side of the Egyptian front, in another place, where Kiryat Gat is now. And for one reason or another, our company commander had to be relieved of his duty, and I became second in command to his second in command, who now became company commander. Within a day, he was shot in his leg, not very serious, but he was hospitalized. And I found myself a company commander. And I remained a company commander almost until the end of the war, which is already a responsibility for 3 platoons, 100, 120 people, some auxiliary weapons, more complicated. And I participated in all the battles that especially were raged in this front in October to break through the Egyptian lines and to reconnect ourselves to the forces in the Negev, in the south, which ended up with the famous Battle of Hulikat. I was of the stormers there, but I kept the basic departure point. So my position was where the commanders of the attack ran the attack. So my brother was of the people who stormed the place. So I was actually part of this whole battle. At the end of the war, by December, our brigade was a first-rate fighting brigade, only second to the Palmach brigades. Lost a lot of people in dead, wounded, fatigue, and the forces were dwindled. So it was decided to merge one of the battalions into the 4 others, and move the brigade to another front to allow the brigade to recuperate and to rest a little bit and to reorganize itself. That was the front in the center of Israel, near Kfar Saba, Petah Tikva, and across the lines we faced the Iraqi army. Toward the very end of the war, January, the war ended really, the war ended by armistice agreements in February, March, and eventually with the Syrians in July. But the fighting war ended in January 7th with the agreement of the Egyptians to start to deal with to deal with Israeli on an armistice agreement, and was a complete ceasefire in all fronts. But 4 days earlier, we launched a little attack, a local attack, on some local auxiliary forces near a kibbutz not far from Kfar Saba, and were then counterattacked during the whole day by heavy artillery shelling, by armored cars, and by infantry storming. And I held the whole day with my little company in this battle, which was perhaps the fiercest battle I had to live through, and I was wounded there. Towards the end of the day, almost at sunset, I was wounded and then taken to hospital. The Iraqis, like other armies, Arab armies, have utilized those Palestinian forces that were left over after the great defeat in April and May, and organized auxiliary groups, also built up in battalions. And there was a position about 800 yards from the perimeter of a kibbutz called Ramat HaKovesh, which was held by Palestinians of this auxiliary force. And they used to snipe and harass the kibbutz. A number of kibbutz members were killed or wounded by sniping fire, and it was decided to take the hill. But we should have known better, because the hill overlooked the main artery that connected the Iraqi forces between Kalkilia, Taibe, and Tulkarem. It was a very important route for them, and now we control by far that route, and they couldn't afford to leave us stay there. And then they brought in the Iraqi army and counterattacked for the whole day. Luckily, the Palestinians created some bunkers and trenches which we could bend in and hide ourselves, but they were built to face the kibbutz to the west, and now we had to face the army attacking us on the east. So they were not quite good for that, which was the difficulty. And being a gallant young officer, I decided to show the soldiers my bravery. And at one point, when I could see 200 yards before me, a few dozen of Iraqi soldiers gathering to begin a last storm on us, I asked somebody to cover me by a light machine gun, and I took some hand grenades and crawled, came as close as I could to the forces, and threw my hand grenades on them. I don't think I reached them, it was too far. But for my people, that was a great bravery feat. I went back, and that somehow stopped that assault that day. Then they tried to assault with some armor cars from another angle. But during the whole day, we were under a barrage of mortars and artillery shells. And one of those mortar shells hit my head here. I was in the trench, and I had a steel helmet. So that defended me, but still I was hit on my left ear, which left it's marked by being deaf completely in my left ear. And I still have a shrapnel here in my bone. They decided not to take it away because it's very near to a nerve. And since it was stuck into this bone, they left it and it's still there. The style of fighting and of conquest of our villages was totally different in the great offensive of April and May and later on, because there were our villages that were occupied by our forces when we followed the retreating Egyptian forces in the south. It was a different story. I'll come to that story in a moment, but the first phase, the normal procedure was that the Haganah would begin by a light shot, not too heavy. We didn't have much weapons and much ammunition. By a short barrage of either light mortars or 3-inch mortars, which are also not very heavy. And then we approach, under the fire of these mortars, we approach the perimeter of the village. Most of these villages were within citrus orchards, so we could come closer by going through between the trees of the orchards. And as we entered the orchard, there was a small pause of a little field, and then there were the houses of the Arabs. Most of the houses were mud-made houses, very poor. Some better houses, but most of them were made of mud. And as we deployed the width of the front with my platoon, say, in front of the houses, we gave a 1-minute coordinated shot of whatever weapons we had and stormed. And in at least 2 or 3 of these places, when we came into the houses, there was nobody there. Occasionally you could see an old woman that couldn't walk, would stay behind. You could see, of course, donkeys, and I even found a beautiful horse there running around the village, chicken, etc. You could come into the houses and notice that most of the places, it was mostly in the evening, say at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, was still coffee on the pot. You could see people lived there until a few minutes ago, but they escaped. And we didn't have to chase them out, as it happened in other places, but not in my case. Obviously, they didn't run away a long way. They ran into the orchards and hid there and waited to see what happens. And if they tried to come back, they were shot at. and eventually they decided to leave altogether and were slowly in this front moving towards the Gaza Strip, where they had started up the refugee camp that are there until today. And the second phase was a different phenomenon, because we were then deployed, say, 2 miles before us were the Egyptian forces. And the Egyptian forces were defending also a few Arab villages. One of them was between the lines, but most of them behind the Egyptian lines. And when our offensive against the Egyptian army in October succeeded to break through into the Negev and Beersheba was conquered, the Egyptians decided to withdraw from Ashdod and from along the seacoast line and regroup themselves in the Gaza Strip. It was, I mean, we didn't know it because there were hills, we couldn't see what they did. And they used a special method of putting wires, nets on the seacoast and made a passable road there and used that road to, within a few hours, evacuate their forces from across where we stood. We only noticed that they to put down the flag from a pole, that the Egyptian flag. That was, and we of course noticed that that is apparently a sign that they are withdrawing, and we got an order to run after them, to pursue them. But we didn't reach them. They did it overnight, and when we came to this area, there was nobody there, including the Arab citizen. When they saw the Arab, the Egyptian force withdrawing, they withdrew too. They were afraid. And I remember as I came within, say, 2-3 miles from the dunes that begin what is now the Gaza Strip. It was somewhat elevated. I stood up there on this little hill, and I could see the white dunes across the valley, as I said, 2 or 3 miles away, black with Arab refugees who was slowly moving up the hills into the Gaza Strip. That's the last I heard from them. And of course then, as I told you before, when there was the talk that they might return, it was decided not to allow them. I think that when we talk about the refugee problem, Benny Morris made a very convincing study of that. But the one point I take an issue with him, it is not so much important whether we chase them or they ran away. It's not their fault that they wanted to run away. After the Racine and the fear of war, I mean, every citizen would run away. So it was not that they deserted their home. They did not desert. They were forced to leave because of the war. And in those places where they didn't do it, we chased them out, like in Lord and Ramleh. But this is really a false debate. Did we chase them or did they run away on their own free volition? They never ran away on their own free volition. The main point, to my mind, of this issue is that Israel, once they left, decided not to allow them back. That's what created the Arab-Palestinian refugee problem. There remained refugees, unlike other wars in which refugees normally go back home after the war. They were not allowed, because it was a war between Zionism, who wanted to have a free land to settle new immigrants, and between the Arabs who launched the war but lost it. As I said, I had good luck not to have the experience of having to chase out Arabs. But by the time I was fighting against the Egyptians, we already knew of events that occurred in other fronts in which I did not participate, in which they were actually ordered out. There's a whole debate whether in Lod and Ramleh they actually were asked to leave, because some evidence showed that they asked to leave. But it's silly, because it was clearly the Israeli army was happy to see them leave. There was Lod and Ramle were very large Arab cities, very large cities, something like 70,000 people, including some refugees from Jaffa that gathered to this area. So relatively large. They were not villages, they were real towns. And in the second phase of the war in July, which we call the 10 Days War, because it launched between the first truce and the second truce, July 9th until July 19th. The main offensive of the Israelis took place in the area of Lod and Ramle, trying to broaden the connection between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And the place was conquered easily because the Arab Legion only put there one company which left in the middle of the battle, and so the Arab Legion did not really defend the local Arabs. And it was only the local, semi-regular, untrained, unweaponed local Arabs that had to defend, and therefore Israel launched the attack with 3 brigades, including one armored brigade. It could easily conquer those places. But it so happened that in Lod, a few hours after the conquest, apparently by mistake, a small group of 4 or 5 Jordanian armored cars burst into Lod and turned around and went back. But apparently the Lod people thought that the Arab Legion at long last comes to defend them, to free them from the Israeli conquest, and rose up with their own weapons and killed some, not many, but let's say a dozen Israeli soldiers were killed by local Arabs at that incident. And as a retaliation, as a result, the Palmach people started to shoot around vantanly. I think that very close to 300 local Arabs were killed, both citizens and fighters. And at that point, the Arab asked if they can leave the place. And they were allowed. Of course, it was clearly a way to see them leave the country. Not many, a few of them remained behind in Ramle, mostly in Ramle, and in Lod, a few hundreds, which are now the local Arab population of both these places. There are in Lod and Ramle Palestinian quarters of those who remained behind. But most of them decided to leave. They were afraid of further massacre like the one that occurred when the Arab Legion burst into the city. We heard all these stories, and of course I, as a historian, researched them later on in great detail. Because of this ambivalent situation, Israelis could believe that they wanted to leave. But again, it's stupid. What do you mean, wanted to leave? They were happy to leave their homes. They were afraid, and they ran to save their lives. So does it matter if the word that we use is chasing or escaping? It really doesn't matter. The fact matters that these people were suffering tremendously as they were running away in thirst and hunger, and in the great heat. Children were abandoned, and then later in the refugee camps when they came up near Ramallah and suffered for many years and are not terribly happy even today. That doesn't mean that I think that they should come back to Lod. As I full-heartedly agree that I would shoot at them if they come back in, say, October, November 1948, I don't think we will need to shoot at them, but I'm fully in agreement to the Israeli policy not to allow more than some special needs cases, not to allow the millions of Palestinian refugees to come back into Israel. They should either come back into what will be the Palestinian state, or get settled where they are, or get settled elsewhere. Israel cannot afford to take back millions of Palestinians and remain what it is today, a state in which I want to live. The other place where there were cases of chasing out Arabs purposely was in Operation Hiram, which took place right after the great victory against the Egyptian army in the south. The Israeli army deployed, I think, 3 or 4 brigades to conquer and capture the whole of the Galil. The forces that defended the Galil were the remnants of the so-called Arab Liberation Army, which was not a well-organized force, although they had artillery, they had armored cars, but they were not well-organized. They were not matched to 3 or 4 Israeli brigades at that point. I know of that battle only as a historian. I had rumors and stories, of course, through friends who were there, but mostly as a historian. I know that some colleagues of mine, including Arabs from the Galil, are convinced that Hiram was aimed at cleaning up or cleansing up the Galil from Arabs. I don't think it's true. The evidence is quite complicated. It may be, that's only a guess and nobody can prove it, that the commander of the Galil front of the Operation Hiram, Moshe Carmel, was a member of a party that advocated a state within the entire country, thought that this is an opportunity to get rid of the Arabs. There are some evidences, but not clear, and nobody can prove it. But even so, it was not the orders of the High Command, or not the purpose of the High Command. You should remember that early on in July, there was another operation in this area in which Israel conquered Nazareth, Operation Dekel. That was in July, in the 10 days for fighting. It was Nazareth and Shafa Amr, which is a smaller town, and a dozen of Arab villages in the lower Galilee. And in almost all of these places, the Arabs did not run away and were not chased out. There was one place, Saforia, where the Arabs ran away. They ran into Nazareth. And to this very day, they are not allowed to go back to Saforia. And there is a neighborhood in Nazareth that is called Saforia, because that's where they got stuck. But on the whole, that operation showed that the Arabs are not running away anymore. They're even not like in Lod and Ramla that they asked to run away. Even not that. They just stayed put. So when Hiram was planned, I think that the mind was that they also will not, all of them, run away. First of all, there were Druze, which was considered somewhat friendly to the Jews. There were a lot of Christians. There was a fear of the impact on the Catholic world or the Christian world if we are going to damage churches and harass Palestinian Christians. There was a light hand, local commander, when they saw an opportunity to see them run away, did that, especially when they were closer to the borders of Lebanon or Syria, where they actually could. The whole battle was very quickly, 3 days, and the whole thing was over. And if you were near the old front line, it took you more than 3 days to get with your children and your belongings to the borders. And most of them did not run away. And when the war was ended, despite this notion among Palestinian and critical Israelis that we planned to empty, to cleanse Galil, the fact was that was not cleansed. The Israelis could have cleansed it if they wanted. It was not that difficult. It was just shooting here and there, creating a massacre in there, which they did in some occasion. There were 2 or 3 such massacres. But the effect was only limited. I don't know the numbers, but at least a good half of the Palestinians of the Galil remained in the Galil and are there now, which to my mind proves that there was no clear-cut policy of cleansing of the Galil. In the Galil, there were 2 cases in which the Arabs, who were Maronite, by the way, had villages right on the new border, on the border of Lebanon, of sovereign Lebanon. And they were asked to leave their villages temporarily. And unfortunately, to this day, they are not allowed to come back. These are really cases of chasing out purposely. In most other cases, part of the population ran away, part of them not. But there were some villages that were completely left empty. And I only knew about it sometimes later when I started to visit the Galil as a tourist, because I continued to serve in the Givati Brigade, which was stationed around Jerusalem and in the center of Israel in the 50s, early 50s. But we would go up to the Galil to see the new territories, to visit friends in kibbutzim, etc. And I could see some of those villages who were laid empty and later on bombed up and destroyed. Some villages were just occupied by new immigrants, as it happened in Lod and Ramle, and some villages in the hilly area near Jerusalem. But all those houses that were not habitable were blown up by the Israeli army. Yes, I remember everything that over the first years. I wasn't part of that, but in my area, especially in the area where 1448, most of villages were made of mud houses. And since it was not clear whether some of the refugees will be allowed to come back or not, so it was stay there, and it started to rot by the rains, by the storms, and it just became a place for snakes and lizards. And eventually, only 2-3 years later, it was decided to bulldoze them. You didn't have to blow it up, because by a bulldozer you just could destroy the half destroyed house from the weather. In the hilly area, the houses were made of stone. So you had to blow it up, you have to explode it. The outstanding story is that in the main towns, houses were not destroyed because they were inhabited by new immigrants. It was only in the villages, because in the villages the Jewish agency preferred to settle new immigrants on the lands, but not in the old site. Because the old site was decrepit, was run down, so they built new houses, modern houses, on the hill next door. And therefore, what was left from the village was destroyed to not to suffer from all kinds of diseases and as I said, reptiles who might find home in those villages. And I think that, of course, although by that time Israel made it clear that it would not allow refugees to come back, but the destroying of empty villages was symbolic also, in the sense of, okay, you're gone, this village is gone, it has a new Hebrew name, forget about the old name. So the story that the Palestinians now make a lot out of, the 400 villages that lost their names and lost, is a true story. Again, it's a way to mythologize the Nakba, the suffering, the injustice for them. From our point of view, it's only part of the whole story, which was basically a displacement of one nation by another, that laid off territories which were wide open for millions of immigrants that started to come in the 50s to the country and were settled in those lands. The State of Israel was declared in Tel Aviv in May 15. Today, this is our Independence Day, according to the Jewish calendar, but that's the time. I don't remember this as a great event. It was in the middle of the war. I was fighting. And I remember sitting on the trenches, hearing those artillery shells, and then somebody came and said, the Jewish state was declared in the old museum in Tel Aviv. Great deal. We already have a state, we have an army, we are fighting for it. It's no novelty. Okay, we're going to have to declare it. So for us, this was not a great day. Somewhat more, there was a great ceremony in all the military camps, sometimes in the second truce, I think it was in August, in which we all were sworn up allegiance to the Israeli army, to the State of Israel. It was festive, we had parties, we had artists coming to show us their art. That was a happy day, which symbolized for us the fact that we are now part of a regular army, an orderly army. The notion of having a state really dawned on me more clearly in the first Independence Day. Unfortunately, the parade that was planned was messed up in Tel Aviv. I wasn't there, but I heard that. The crowd was so excited that they didn't allow the Israeli troops to pass by the streets. So the whole thing fell apart. It was known as the failed parade. But that didn't diminish the joy for us of commemoration of the day, which we missed at that time. But now realize that that's what we have achieved. That was the war we fought for, and now we have this state, and the state has boundaries. Although it's only armistice agreement, although it's only armistice lines, but its borders, we know where we are, and very soon Jerusalem will be our capital, and all the trappings of a state were clear to all of us. We could turn our mind now to some criticism of how we run our state, which lasts from then until today. And as I go up older, I become more critical of what we do, both internally and externally, but that's a different story. But at that time, we were all very patriotic. I was still in the army. I was then already a major, I think, with important position in the army. So the notion that we have a state of our own was for me very gratifying. Even though I thought that at one point that we might have a binational state, I was very glad that we have a mono-national state, that we could live among Jews, letting the Jews decide for our own fortune. Very soon we had troubles, we had infiltration across the border, we have continued fighting all the way to the Sinai War in '56, the 6 Days War. But these were minor problems. The main feeling at the beginning was that we are controlling our own destinies. I'm not original in that, and I read a lot about things that happened like that, even in the terrible front lines in World War I in Flandria. There is some sense of compassion you develop to your enemy, especially on the level of the simple soldier. I remember many times where I found in the field 2 or 3 Egyptian soldiers that died in previous battle, and I found them lying there and we buried them. I remember talking to them over the wireless, because you could kind of join into their lines, and some of us used to curse, and some of them would joke with them, and there was some sort of a development of fraternity among people who have to rot in the trenches, like in World War I in a way, although it was a different kind of a war. I remember that I had that feeling, although when you had to face head-on fighting soldiers, you had no doubts. I remember at one point I was lying in an ambush, and these were Palestinians who came back to the fields to reap the harvest, and they came back, and one of them was going in the front to make sure that the road is open. And I was lying across the road with a revolver in my hand, and as he approached me, I stood up, and he was a meter from me. He was so frightened that he embraced me. Then I became frightened. I didn't know what he has, a weapon, a revolver, a knife, so I shot at him. And that's a very strange experience. He fell to the ground from my hands. So I was killing a man point blank, just right there. I didn't blame myself. I didn't have any feeling of remorse because I had no chance. I had to do it. It was only natural that I should have reacted the way I reacted. So that's on the other hand. But I looked down on him and I said, poor fellow, you've got it.